Sometimes inventors get carried away. They dream of combining two vehicles into one, hoping to create something revolutionary, a tank that flies, a car that sails, or a train that hovers. But most of the time, the result isn't a revolution, it's a disaster. Here are 5 of the strangest hybrid vehicles ever attempted, machines that tried to be 2 things at once and ended up being neither. During World War II, Soviet engineers were constantly searching for unconventional ways to gain an edge on the battlefield. Outnumbered and often outgunned, they experimented with designs that today seem almost absurd. Among the strangest was the dream of a flying tank. The result was the Antonov A-40, also known as the Krylia Tanka, literally the tank with wings. Engineers took a standard T-60 light tank weighing about 6 tons and stripped it of weapons, ammunition, headlights, and even reduced its fuel load to make it lighter. Then they bolted on enormous wooden biplane-style wings and a tail assembly, turning the armored vehicle into a bizarre hybrid of glider and tank. The plan was simple in theory. A long-range bomber would tow the tank into the air, release it near the battlefield, and the tank would glide down. Upon landing, the crew could detach the wings in minutes and roll straight into combat. On paper, it was ingenious. In practice, it was a nightmare. Even reduced in weight, the T-60 was still far too heavy. Combined with its glider frame, it pushed the towing aircraft, a Tupolev TB-3 bomber, to its absolute limits. In the single test conducted in 1942, the drag was so immense that the TB-3 barely gained altitude, engines straining at full power. Fearing disaster, the pilot released the tank early. For a brief moment, the A-40 actually glided. A surreal sight, a Soviet tank floating through the air with wings like something out of a comic book. The flight was short, but the tank touched down in a field without major damage. The crew detached the wings and drove it back to base, proving the idea wasn't entirely impossible, but it was hopelessly impractical. With the Soviet Air Force already stretched thin, and with no aircraft powerful enough to tow the flying tank at the required speeds, the project was quietly abandoned after that lone attempt. No battlefield ever saw a glider-borne tank, and the Antonov, a 40, was left as one of the strangest what-ifs of the war. Today, it survives only in memory as a symbol of both the extreme innovation and desperation that defined World War II. The flying tank never advanced beyond a prototype, but it remains a perfect example of Soviet engineers pushing imagination beyond reason, daring to test an idea that looked ridiculous. Because in wartime, even the impossible was worth a try. This wasn't just a tank. It was a rolling fortress straight out of science fiction. A giant armored pod on tracks with the potential to be powered by a nuclear reactor. In the mid-1950s, with the Cold War at its peak, the US military was imagining what the battlefield of the future might look like. Nuclear energy was being hailed as the power source of tomorrow. If it could run cities and submarines, why not put it inside a tank? That was the thinking behind Chrysler's radical concept, the TV-8. Unlike conventional tanks, the TV-8 broke all the rules of design. Instead of a long hull with a turret mounted on top, engineers envisioned a bulbous, pod-shaped upper section that contained almost everything: the crew, the gun, the ammunition, and the engine. This pod sat on a relatively small tracked chassis whose only real job was to provide suspension and mobility. The design made the turret look enormous, almost cartoonishly oversized compared to the base. Inside this armored pod, the crew would operate a 90mm cannon, machine guns, and targeting systems, while being theoretically better protected thanks to the thick, rounded armor. But the most astonishing proposal wasn't the shape. It was what Chrysler suggested could power the tank: a compact nuclear reactor. The idea was both ambitious and terrifying. A nuclear-powered tank, in theory, could operate for weeks without refueling, giving the army unmatched endurance on the battlefield. But in practice, the risks were obvious. Driving what was essentially a small nuclear power plant into combat zones filled with enemy artillery, mines, and missiles was asking for disaster. one lucky shot, and the battlefield could become a radioactive wasteland. No prototype of the TV-8 was ever constructed. The design never left the drawing board, abandoned as both impractical and dangerously unrealistic. Yet the concept remains one of the strangest and most extreme examples of Cold War military thinking, a reflection of the era's obsession with nuclear energy and futuristic technology. Today, the TV-8 exists only as concept art and scale models, but it continues to fascinate military historians. It's a reminder that not every bold idea belongs on the battlefield, and that sometimes the line between innovation and insanity is thinner than armor plating. In the years after World War II, military planners were obsessed with the idea of mobility. The battlefield of the future, they believed, wouldn't be won by tanks crawling along the ground, but by vehicles that could leap over obstacles, ignore terrain, and deliver men and supplies wherever they were needed. Out of this vision came one of the strangest experiments of the 1950s, the flying jeep. The concept sounded like something out of a pulp science fiction magazine. Why rely on helicopters, still relatively new, expensive, and complex at the time, when you could design a cheap, lightweight craft that combined the simplicity of a jeep with the vertical lift of a hovercraft? The US Army imagined squadrons of these vehicles buzzing low over forests, rivers, or minefields, delivering soldiers and cargo straight into the fight. One of the most ambitious attempts to make this dream real was the Curtiss-Wright 5Z7. At first glance, it hardly looked like a vehicle at all. Instead of wheels or tracks, it was basically a rectangular platform mounted on 4, originally ducted, later unshrouded, fans, with a single pilot seat perched on top like a lawn chair bolted to a giant drone. The controls were straightforward, and its purpose was brutally simple. Point it where you wanted to go, lift off, and skim across the battlefield. And incredibly, it worked. In 1958, test pilots were able to take the VZ7 into the air. It could hover a few feet above the ground, move forward, backward, and sideways with decent precision, and respond quickly to control inputs. For the Army, which had expected little more than a prototype that might wobble off the ground, the VZ7 was a genuine surprise. Watching a boxy platform with a soldier seated on top float over the airfield must have seemed like a glimpse of the future, but the problems were obvious. The VZ7 was very noisy, killing any hope of stealth. Its exposed design left the pilot completely unprotected from enemy fire, or even from accidents during landing. More importantly, although it could hover stably, it failed to meet Army altitude and speed requirements, and its stability margin in turbulence or abrupt maneuvers was limited. For soldiers expected to use it in chaotic combat zones, that was unacceptable. At the same time, helicopters were improving rapidly. Unlike the fragile flying jeep, helicopters could carry more troops, more cargo, fly higher, and offer better safety for their crews. The Army realized that while the VZ7 was a bold experiment, it had no real future. By 1960, the project was cancelled and the 2 prototypes were quietly retired. The Curtiss-Wright VZ7 never went to war, never carried soldiers into battle, and never became the squadron of sky jeeps its designers had imagined. But it remains one of the most fascinating what-ifs of Cold War aviation, a reminder of a time when the future of warfare was being imagined not just with jets and rockets, but with outlandish machines that seemed lifted straight from the pages of science fiction. In the 1960s, Germany unveiled one of the strangest vehicles of the post-war era, the Amphicar Model 770, proudly marketed as the car that swims. On the surface, it looked like a slightly odd but charming little convertible, with high fenders, rounded lines, and a playful personality. But underneath its quirky looks lay an audacious promise. This was a car that could drive straight off the road and into the water. To achieve that, the Amphicar's designers gave it features no ordinary automobile had. The body was shaped like a watertight hull, The doors were specially sealed against leaks, and mounted at the rear were twin propellers powered by the same engine that drove the wheels. With a simple lever, the driver could switch from land mode to water mode. In theory, you could commute across a river, launch into a lake for a picnic, or simply amaze your neighbors by driving down a boat ramp without stopping. Performance, however, revealed the limits of the dream. On land, the Amphicar could reach about 70 miles per hour. On the water, about 7 miles per hour, approximately 6 knots. Steering on water was handled by turning the front wheels, which acted as rudders, making it about as graceful as a brick with paddles. Even small waves, gusts of wind, or strong currents could throw it off course, turning any serious voyage into a nerve-wracking affair. Maintenance was another headache. The owner's guidance called for greasing 13 points after water operation to keep moisture out, and rust was a relentless enemy if upkeep slipped. Neglect could mean leaks and an unnerving rise in bilge water, the sort of demo drives that ended with damp passengers and bruised pride. Still, novelty has its allure. Roughly 3,800 Amphicars were produced, most exported to the United States, where post-war optimism made a receptive market. Celebrities, even President Lyndon B. Johnson, owned Amphicars, with LBJ famously pranking guests by losing the brakes and rolling straight into his ranch lake. But beyond the laughs, the Amphicar could never escape its compromises. It wasn't a great car, and it wasn't a great boat. By the late 1960s, changing US standards and disappointing sales pushed the Amphicar into history. Yet its charm endures. Today, surviving examples appear at classic car shows and swim-ins, celebrated less as feats of engineering and more as cheerful curiosities, reminders of an age when inventors thought the future might just float. In the late 1940s, America was caught up in visions of the future. The war was over, prosperity was booming, and popular magazines were filled with bold predictions. Atomic-powered homes, personal helicopters, vacations on the moon, and, perhaps most exciting of all, flying cars. If the family automobile had already transformed daily life, surely the next step was to give it wings. Then known as Consolidated Vultee, Convair decided to try. Better known for building bombers and large military aircraft, its engineers believed they could create a hybrid vehicle that would let ordinary people drive to the airport, snap on a set of wings, and lift into the sky. The result was the ConvAirCar, one of the most unusual machines of its era. At first glance, the car part of the ConvAirCar looked almost ordinary. A stubby two-door sedan with seating for 4. But sitting on the roof was a mounting frame that could hold a large wing and propeller unit with twin tail booms. On the highway, it was supposed to function like a small automobile. At the airport, you would snap on the aircraft components, fire up the flight engine, and take off like a light plane. The vision was dazzling. Commuters soaring above traffic jams, suburban families flying off for weekend getaways, all with a vehicle parked in their own driveway. And for a moment, it looked as if Convair had cracked the code. The prototype did work. It could be driven on the road and flown in the air. But the dream ended almost as soon as it began. In November 1947, during a demonstration flight, disaster struck. The test pilot ran out of aviation fuel after checking the car's fuel gauge instead of the aircraft's. With no power, the ungainly hybrid stalled, crashed, and was destroyed. Fortunately, the pilot survived with minor injuries. The timing could not have been worse. Investors had gathered to witness the future of transportation. Instead, they saw a wreck. Although a second prototype was assembled, reusing the wing, and flown on January 29, 1948, enthusiasm had evaporated, and Convair soon cancelled the program. In the end, only a handful of photographs and blueprints remained to remind us of one of the most ambitious attempts at a flying car. The ConvAirCar proved an important lesson. Sometimes blending two machines doesn't give you the best of both worlds. It gives you the weaknesses of each. Too heavy and inefficient to be a good plane, Too complex and impractical to be a good car, it was doomed from the start. If you had fun watching, don't forget to like and subscribe, and check out the next video waiting for you.